Next up, we have Dr. Zahra Stardust. Zahra is a digital media scholar working at the intersections of sexuality, technology, and law. Please welcome Zahra.
Hello, or Jingari in Yugambeh language where I'm from. Thank you so much for having me. It's a privilege to be here, and I would like to pay my respect to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and acknowledge elders past, present and emerging as the traditional and ongoing custodians of this land and of this place, which was and always will be Aboriginal land. Today we're speaking about art and politics, and Sen has spoken about fabulousness and visibility, and so I want to extend on that and speak about the human right to freedom of expression, and in particular about the moderation of sexual expression on social media as it impacts LGBTIQ+ people. Freedom of expression is a human rights issue of international concern. The Yogyakarta Principles note that this right applies to individuals regardless of gender identity, that expression includes speech, it includes deportment, it includes dress, bodily characteristics, choice of name and more. However, as many of you will know, social media platforms have often policies that restrict or prohibit consensual sexual communication, expression and representation, and it disproportionately affects queer folk, trans folk, people of colour, sex workers, disabled people, fat people, sex educators, artists and more. In 2021, the UN Secretary General specifically noted the problem of erroneous content removal when digital platforms prohibit nudity and sexual content. And perhaps the most recent example you may have seen in the media is Instagram's removal of two posts by two trans content creators who were fundraising for top surgery when they were flagged under Meta's nudity and sexual solicitation policies. And the Oversight Board recently reviewed this and found that the content, of course, did not violate those policies and should never have been removed in the first place. This is just one example among many. We know that platforms have preemptively shut down spaces that have been safe havens for LGBTQIA+ people. Tumblr as an example, they've actively shadow banned, demoted, demonetized or suspended queer content creators, so much so that in 2022, Tumblr settled discrimination allegations with the New York City's Commission on Human Rights after they implemented an automated sexual content takedown system that disproportionately affected queer users, and YouTube have also apologised for how their restricted mode feature was blocking LGBTQ content. In 2019, 8 queer content creators on YouTube filed a class action against Google to stop their discriminatory content regulation practices. A couple of years ago in 2021 at the RightsCon Summit on Human Rights in the Digital Age, a few other scholars and activists and I came together and we held a community lab on alternative frameworks for sexual content moderation. And we brought together community organisations, advocates, academics, and we wanted to consider how social media platforms could better understand sexual content. And our rationale was that social media is taking on an increasingly central role in shaping cultural life, and yet platforms are making arbitrary and unaccountable decisions about the kinds of sex and sexualities that are visible in online space. So following the conference, we created this manifesto for sex-positive social media. That's one I want to share with you today. We use the term sex-positive because we see value in bringing sex-positive thinking to platform governance. In doing so, we're not suggesting that all sex is positive, nor are we suggesting that sex be compulsory or universally enjoyed. Rather, we reject the sexual stigmas that underlie many of these platforms' approaches to sex and want to affirm a diversity of practices, desires, activities, identities, to value pleasure-focused, non-judgmental, culturally relevant sex education, consent training, relationship skills, and to support people to communicate their needs and boundaries and to respect others, and actively build cultures among us that are accessible and equitable and accountable. So the manifesto sets out 7 principles that platforms, governance and policymakers can take into account in their design and moderation practices. It's not a set of technical instructions. It's very much a living document. It remains in progress. And I'd like to shout out to our incredible artist, Jack Moon, who illustrated the manifesto for us. The first principle of the manifesto is to destigmatize sex. This involves a process of unlearning cultural narratives. Sexual content is not inherently harmful or risky or dangerous or offensive or inappropriate. Kink does not equate to violence. Nudity should not be conflated with sexuality. Fat is not offensive. Pornography can be artistic. Conversely, art can be pornographic. And algorithms cannot determine the gender of a person's nipples. It sounds obvious, but you need to spell these things out for straight people. Platforms shouldn't conflate different kinds of sexual content or treat them as one homogenous, harmful category. There's infinite kinds of sexual media that have very different functions for creators and consumers, including expression and identity, intimacy, connection, creativity, and work. The second demand is to integrate sexual cultures into existing platforms. Because when online spaces are sexually sanitized and they're segregated and they're gentrified, the public discourse around sex and gender is really impoverished. By integrating sexual media alongside other content, it can normalize sex, open up critical conversations between users, make a variety of genders, identities, sexualities, practices visible in a way that is very affirming and validating. We know that sex education and health promotion, community building, harm reduction material, access to information on abortion, justice, safety, health is often really life-saving for individuals and communities. And sexual content can be integrated in a way that doesn't cause harm, for example, by giving users agency to choose to access it or choose to avoid it. Third, platforms need to value sexual content creators. Major social media platforms has a history of exploiting sexual content to grow their user base and then purging sexual content creators once they've made it. OnlyFans is a great example. This process of economic exploitation treats sexual content creators as disposable. But we all know that sex work is real work. Sexual content creation involves sexual, creative, emotional labor. And so platforms need to develop ways in which to respect and value those creators. And that's not just simply through visibility around traffic, but also in material ways like equitable distribution of profits, supporting their collective organizing, encouraging user respect, because denying services and resources and spaces to sex workers is not just discriminatory, but it contributes to violence and isolation, marginalization, and economic precarity. Fourth, platforms must proactively build safer spaces. Part of that is that they need to explicitly set out the values and ethics that guide their community standards. Say on your face value that they're heteronormative community standards instead of pretending that they are neutral. And instead of using standards around decency and proprietary and offensiveness, which are often related to class and modesty, as measures to assess sexual content, platforms could address content or behavior practices that reproduce structural oppressions. So they could be promoting cultures of body positivity or bodily autonomy or data sovereignty or consent or accessibility or anti-oppression as their framework. And instead of using restrictive, repressive regimes as their baseline standard for governing sexual content, they could look beyond these iterations of illegality and legality in domestic jurisdictions because they're not necessarily determinative of whether content is consensual or ethical either. Building safer spaces also requires shifts in the structures and the businesses and the revenue models of platforms to prioritize sexually marginalized communities and as knowledgeable stakeholders, as decision makers and leaders. And that's not just saying let's put more queer people into Facebook. Its regulatory environments need to support independent and cooperative, collaborative models of governance. While they over-police sexual content, platforms still lack a really holistic response to addressing harassment, image-based abuse, malicious flagging, sexual racism, the theft of sexual content. So we put forward that the uploading and the sharing and the reproduction of content needs to be based on express, informed, specific and dynamic consent. In that sense, it needs to be specific for purpose and able to be withdrawn. And users should be able to place limits on boundaries on how their content is shared and by whom. Platforms need to have policies to prevent and address harmful behaviour with a variety of options for reporting, including those that don't involve giving your government-issued identification to Google or using criminal law mechanisms. Platforms also really need to be transparent about their relationships with law enforcement and have a policy that they will only share their data with law enforcement in case of a warrant or a court order or subpoena, which is not general practice. Platforms need to be allowing people to access spaces without giving over their legal names or their identity documents or through biometric or behavioural verification, because we know that allowing users to have multiple accounts and engage using pseudonyms reflects that people's identities are multifaceted, and it affords us all the power to compartmentalise our lives. Number 6, platforms should have accessible appeals processes for users who have had their content removed. They ought to regularly record, explain, justify their moderation practices and decisions with clear and transparent policies. They need to make their data, disaggregated data available to users, to researchers, to the public, including data about how things were flagged, about complaints, decisions, their recommender systems and their suppression systems, suspensions, takedowns, as well as how they are interpreting the very nebulous categories of sensitive and borderline content. Moderators too, who we know are very much underpaid, should have in-depth understanding about the platform, be invested in the communities and be well-trained and supported, resourced and compensated for their work. Platforms also need to make their algorithms transparent and explainable and available for scrutiny so that users can evaluate how their sexual content is being ranked or labelled or classified and sorted. Lastly, technical solutions will not be sufficient alone. Platforms ought to participate in a broader movement for social and sexual justice. Sex-positive media requires legal, policy, economic, cultural and technical environments that enable a more vibrant and diverse and informed, equitable and just sexual cultures. And at a state level, this requires comprehensive and culturally relevant sex education. Governments need to decriminalise sexual activity, repeal laws that hinder access to sex education, to health promotion, to safety information and harm reduction materials. They need to regulate to prevent the formation of media monopolies and support the proliferation of independent media. Because if we want to end whorephobia, transphobia, homophobia, racism, sizeism, ageism on social media, then we need to end it offline as well. These are just 7 principles to prompt platforms and governments to think more critically about their role in shaping sexual cultures. You can read more about the manifesto at our website, sexpositivesocialmedia.org, when you could also sign on to a petition and access a reading list with more research on this issue. In summary, this is not just an issue of tweaking algorithms or revising community standards, but it's really about systemic changes to the current assemblage of power, labour and value on social media platforms. Thanks.